In this video, we are going to talk about the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, and the zygomatic bone. Right, starting with the nasal bone. The right and left nasal bones articulate with each other at the intranasal suture, right? So you can see here in between. They also articulate with the frontal bone here, with the maxilla on the sides, and with the ethmoid bone. The nasal bones form a bridge of the nose, right? So they form the nasal bridge, right? So this is the external surface, and this is the internal surface, right? And here you can actually see the sulcus ethmoidalis for the articulation with the ethmoid bone sample. The next bone is the lacrimal bone. Right, so lacrimal bone is a very important bone. So you can see here the lacrimal bone lodged here. I just told you about the nasal bone. So this is the nasal bone. This is the lacrimal bone, right? And there is a fossa, or the lacrimal fossa. And in between here, you can see the frontal process of the maxilla here, right? So focus on here, the lacrimal bone. Right. So the lacrimal bone, os lacrimale, is a paired bone. Is a thin plate forming the medial wall of the orbit immediately behind the frontal process of the maxilla. Its lateral surface carries the posterior lacrimal crest, cresta lacrimalis posterior. The lacrimal groove, sulcus lacrimalis, passes in the front of this crest. In an intact skull, together with the same groove of the frontal process of the maxilla, they form the fossa for the lacrimal sac. Fossa saxi lacrimalis, right? And this sac is continuous with the nasolacrimal canal. Right, so here is another image showing the lacrimal bone, right? So you can see sulcus lacrimalis. You can see the crest here, cresta lacrimalis posterior, and the fossa sulci lacrimalis, and it also have this humulus down, humulus, like a hook. The next bone is the zygomatic bone, os zygomaticum. So here in green is the zygomatic bone, right? Lateral view, and this is anterior view, right? They are cheekbones, right? So zygomatic bone is a paired bone and is the strongest bone of the skull. The prominence of the cheeks and much of the infratemporal margins of the orbit are formed by the zygomatic bones, or the cheekbones, right? You can see here this margin, the infratemporal margin. They articulate with the maxilla, frontal bone, sphenoid bone, and the parietal bones, right? So you can see articulation with the frontal bone here. Next with the maxilla, right? With the maxilla here. With the sphenoid, you cannot see it exactly here, but it's somewhere here. You can see it in this view. And then with the temporal bones, you can see it. I told you that the temporal process of the zygomatic bone makes the anterior 1/3 of the zygomatic arch. Right, so the zygomatic bone has 3 surfaces and 2 processes. Let's start with the surfaces. The lateral surface, facies lateralis. Right, so the lateral surface is shaped like a 4-point star, and it bulges slightly. On this surface, there is a zygomaticofacial foramen, zygomaticofaciale, for the nerves of the same name. The second surface is the temporal surface, facies temporalis, which is a smooth posterior surface which faces the temporal fossa. And on this surface, there is zygomaticotemporal foramen zygomaticotemporale, for the nerves of the same name. And Lastly, there is orbital surface, facies orbitalis, which takes part in the formation of the orbital walls. And on this orbital surface, there is zygomatical orbital foramen. Foramen zygomatical orbital, right? So you can see it's very easy, right? It's very easy. On the face or on the lateral one is zygomatical faciale. And then on the temporal surface, there is what? There is foramen zygomatico temporale, and on the orbital surface, there is foramen zygomatico orbitale. Right, okay. So this is the zygomatic bone, right? So this is the lateral surface. You can see the orbital surface here, right? Okay, so let's go one by one. Well, number one is temporal processus temporalis. Number two is lateral surface, facies lateralis, what we just talked about. There is processus frontalis on number three, the frontal process. Number four, tuberculum marginale. This one is the marginal tubercle, tuberculum marginale. On number five, there is foramen zygomatico faciale. Zygomatico faciale is on the lateral surface. I told you about this. Then there is facies temporalis, the temporal surface on number six, right? That's where the temporal fossa is. Then foramen zygomatico temporale is found on the same surface. Then there is orbital eminence, eminentia orbitalis on number 8 here. Then facies orbitalis on number 9, this orbital surface, and 10, foramina zygomatico orbitale. Foramina zygomatico orbitale. You know, the names are very easy actually because they tell you where each foramen is located, right? Okay. Then next, we just talked about the surfaces, right? Then the processes. The frontal process, processus frontalis, I showed you this. It projects superiorly and articulates with the zygomatic process of the frontal bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. This process forms the lateral border of the orbit also. The second process is the temporal process, processus temporalis. It projects laterally, articulate with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone to form the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch can be easily palpated on the side of the head and posterior to the zygomatic prominence. These arches are especially prominent in emaciated persons. A horizontal plane passing medially from the zygomatic arch separates the temporal fossa superiorly from the infratemporal fossa inferiorly, right? Okay, we will talk more about this in skull as a whole. It's going to be a long video, right? So I want to show you the processes again. The frontal process, the temporal process, right? Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe so that you won't miss any of our latest videos. In the next and final video, we will talk about the vomer, the mandible, and the hyoid bone.